Thank you all for attending today, the launch of Netpol's second annual State of Protest report, which covers the attacks on freedom of assembly and the right to protest over the last year. My colleague, our research coordinator, Mayor Fitchett, will talk about what the report says, but we're also joined by two fantastic guests. Ayo Khalil, who is a NHS psychiatry doctor and an organiser who advocates for the healthcare rights of political prisoners in Britain, and Huda Ammori, who is a direct action campaigner, one of the co-founders of Palestine Action, and who I'm delighted to welcome back to another Netpol event, but this time for the first time since her successful legal challenge that found that the government's terrorism ban on Palestine Action was unlawful. We're obviously all hoping for even more good news when the government's appeal verdict is eventually announced at the end of April. Now, before we come to our speakers, I want to say a few words about why it is that we publish these reports. For more than a decade, Netpol has been documenting the police's indifference to the rights of people who protest, especially protests that are against state and corporate power. But the last couple of years has really felt markedly different, largely because millions of people all over the world have had to come out onto the streets against the backdrop of the genocide against Palestinians by Israeli occupation forces in Gaza, all supported, as you all know, politically and militarily by our own government and by a media that has, in parallel, deliberately set out to portray protesters as the real villains of this moment. As a result of which, so much has happened over the course of the last couple of years. Every new restriction on a march, every instance of the policing of placards and chants, every arbitrary arrest, every false allegation that protesters supposedly represent a threat to communities. And after a while, everything just starts to blur into one. It's just yet another moment of outrage and frustration, and then it's on to the next one, right? And this is what we mean by state of repression and protest becoming routine. So we've tried to document it, we've tried to make sense of it, not as some academic exercise, but so that collectively we can try and work out what's coming next. And equally importantly, work out how best to resist whatever is coming next. And it's in the hope that, for example, police tactics highlighted in the report against anti-fascists opposing the far right in Brighton, which Mayor will likely talk about later. Sorry, not in Brighton, in Bristol, which Mayor will likely talk about later, have not become commonplace by this time next year. And it's because we know from history that left unchallenged, repression that becomes routine is only likely to grow worse, with yet more red lines crossed by a government that back in 2024, many people genuinely hoped would be less repressive than the government of the ones that we suffered under from Priti Patel and Suella Braverman. And yet this government has prescribed a non-violent direct action group as terrorists. Right now it's banning marches for the first time in over a decade. It's been egged on by politicians and the media who want more bans, who want more restrictions, who also have little appetite for challenging the powers of the police, and who in many instances refuse to accept at all that human rights are under attack. Now, unfortunately, Netpol can't predict the future, but we do think we can give it a good shot. And that's why we bring together the case studies, the interviews, the legal observer notes, the stats, the media reporting, all together in one place as a way to try and work out how best to keep each other safe on the streets over the coming year. On the assumption, I have to say, that if we don't do it, there's a fair chance that nobody else will. So with that as the backdrop to how and why we've decided to do these reports, I want to hand over to Maya, who can explain exactly what this year's report actually says. Over to you, Maya.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Kevin, and thank you to everyone who's dialed in. So, as Kevin mentioned, I'm Mayor Fitchett. I'm a research and operations coordinator at Netpol. I started in July last year, and I started writing this report pretty much immediately, given that there was already so much to cover. And before I start, I just wanted to give a huge, huge thanks and shout out to all of the people that provide us with interviews and testimonies and evidence and notes and everything else. And just to say that this report wouldn't have been possible without everyone's willingness to share some really vulnerable and personal and often traumatizing accounts of police repression. So thank you. And also thank you to the legal support networks and the legal observers who, without this sort of oversight of what's happening on the streets and not just what's written in law, would be pretty much non-existent. So yeah, thank you. As Kevin mentioned, this is the second of Netpol's annual State of Protest reports. And I actually wanted to start where the last report ended. So Kevin, as he mentioned, wrote the last report, which was quite a big act to follow. And the title of that was This is Repression. And in the conclusion, he asked whether the next report would show repression increasing public support for protests. And I think the answer to that is definitely yes. We've definitely seen people continue to show up, whether that is for Palestine, against fascism, against racist violence, quite often in defense of protests itself over the past year. We've seen people continue to mobilize in numbers. And that's not only in spite of repressive trends, but also because of them. However, as I wrote in the conclusion, I think the fact that resistance continues should not be mistaken for healthy democratic space. Because what we're seeing isn't just more repression, it's that repression is becoming normal, which is why we settled on titling the report How Repression Became Routine, although I have to give a special shout out to my mum who actually came up with that. But yeah, I think the framing is really quite important because the message last year was about a sort of taking stock of a change. It was something noticeable, an uptick. It was something that we could meaningfully call repression. And Kevin wrote in the last report that this was a bit of a wake-up call for those who would typically attribute repression to the state, disappearing protesters or banning opponents or attacks on journalists. And I think what can be said for this report is that unless you've been gliding through 2025 with your eyes shut, lots of this will not be a surprise. And I think to me, the fact that it's not shocking, that kind of indicates that something has shifted. And we're starting to see some of those things that people often associate with overtly authoritarian contexts starting to appear here, whether that is treatment of legal observers and of journalists, prolonged detention of activists without trial to the point where UN legal experts have sort of intervened to categorize them as enforced disappearance, or even the use of terrorism legislation in ways that would have felt, if not sort of unthinkable, very shocking a few years ago. I think what we're looking at now isn't an isolated overreach. It's not bad decisions. It's not even sort of a heavy-handed approach of some police or some police forces. It's actually a system that's increasingly organised around and premised on the suppression of dissent. And I'm being quite deliberate in saying that because I think there can be a tendency to maybe frame this as a drift or a sort of unintended consequence. But when you drill down into the legislative change and the police tactics, and you sort of take that alongside the media and the sort of political rhetoric, we can see that it is, yeah, something quite intentional. So yeah, unsurprisingly, the report paints quite a sort of gloomy picture. And I'll just go now through the main findings. They weren't the only things that came out of the report, but they felt like the clearest sort of patterns. And I'll just try and frame them in that context that I've just spoken about, like not just what's happening, but what that actually means. So can I just get, yes, thank you, Sam. You're ahead of me. Um, so I'm just going to share the executive summary or the main findings while I talk through, just in case anyone finds it easier to follow a bit of a visual aid. So the first point is that we're actually seeing an increasing pattern of police using and applying powers that they don't actually have. And there are two ways that the report identifies this as having happened. One is the application of powers which have been tabled but are yet to move through parliamentary approval procedures. So namely, this is the power for the police to impose restrictions on protests due to their cumulative impact. It's already an extremely draconian measure in itself, given that the cumulative impact is very loosely defined as any repeated protest in the same area, and that doesn't need to be a sort of connection between those protests. They don't even need to be particularly disruptive, they just need to be sustained over time. Now, obviously, that has implications for sustained solidarity protests in particular. And the cumulative impact restrictions sit within the crime and policing bill, but that hasn't yet passed into law. A couple of examples of the Met using these powers are the banning of weekly International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network protests, or IJAM protests in Swiss Cottage in May. And the Met also forced the Palestine Solidarity Coalition to change the route of their march in November. Both times, the cumulative effect of those protests was cited. And then very much related to that is the second way that powers are being applied. So it's the use of powers that have already been struck down as unlawful. Under the previous government, Suella Braverman attempted to introduce this definition of serious disruption, which would assert the threshold as a more than minor hindrance to people's daily lives. So obviously that's a very low threshold to set the definition at. In 2024, the High Court then went on to rule that the government had acted beyond their powers. And yet, what we saw in early 2025 was prosecutions take place for protest activity, which could really only have been considered criminal in the context of that very low threshold. So the main example of that being the Just Stop Oil trio, who were prosecuted for walking too slowly in February of 2025. And I think this just points to the willingness to operate beyond the borders of legality because the objective is to disrupt protests, no matter what the cost of that is on legal consistency. Um, Thank you. So the second point, now, yeah, as I've mentioned, police have these sort of multiple powers at their disposal. They're increasingly discretionary in nature. The powers are being used to confuse protesters, and there's a sort of climate of fear created, which in turn results in this freeze or a sort of chilling effect on protest. This isn't new, but I think we have seen a few areas of clear escalation this year. Um, and this growing number of powers creates a very confusing and sort of uncertain atmosphere. It's much harder for activist groups and for legal support groups to share their experiences and their strategies when you have different police forces across the country using different legislation to the same effect or to police the same sort of protests. And it's much harder for tactics to be developed in response to police actions when it's unclear how the police will act. And I think often this can leave even the most knowledgeable of protesters unsure and unclear about not necessarily what their rights are, but how their rights might be interpreted by increasingly powerful police forces. Part of this is also due to the sort of arbitrary application of those powers, including where the police themselves are unsure of where and how to apply legislation. And I think when you think about this pretty enormous suite of powers that has been swept in over the past 5 or so years, it really feels like quite a dangerous situation where the police are both emboldened by a climate of political impunity, and also equipped with powers that they don't really understand. And of course, that ends up being very closely linked to this trend of arrests, which don't result in prosecutions. They are themselves enabled by powers with a very low threshold for arrest, which we've again seen sort of grow in number over the past few years. And I'm talking about things like conspiracy charges, for example. Um, I think it's important to be clear about what those arrests actually do. And regardless of outcomes, they are a sort of explicit display of state power and they carry a very personal impact. And something that shone through really, really clearly in the interviews and testimonies was the lasting effect that these have on people's lives. And I just wanted to quote one of these interviews because I think it really brings it home. Someone said, "This is a silent battle you fight alone and mostly invisible to others. The damage doesn't stop when you're released, it follows you home." Can I have the next slide, please, Sam? Thank you. Oh, I actually switched the points around. Could I go to point 4 first? Thank you. So the next finding just looks at geographical spread of protest restrictions. And what we often see is the Met will take the lead, and there's usually this sort of trickle outwards as other forces adopt those restrictions. This tends to start with some of the larger forces, so Greater Manchester Police, Avon and Somerset Police, etc. But there are sometimes anomalies within this. So, for example, in recent data, we actually saw Northumbria Police record very high uses of restrictions on static protests. We have had, as I've mentioned, a lot of restrictions put in place over the past 5 years or so, but it's taken a while for them to actually trickle into operational policing and be used. I think the other thing that's worth highlighting within this is this isn't just the individual use of powers, but also trends in the way that police forces use sequences of powers and sort of forces across the country reflecting these patterns in the use of protest restrictions. Those patterns are used in quite a savvy way, where they quite often start with suspicion-free powers, so the ability for police to intervene without requiring suspicion of criminal activity. They then give way for very discretionary powers. And essentially, the grounds for sort of intervention or arrest are manufactured. And a huge part of the motivation for this is that sort of intelligence gathering function, where powers are used that require people to provide personal details. And this then allows the police to map individuals and map movements. So again, this isn't random. I think overall, this is actually reflective of a more sort of coordinated attempt to managing and preempting protest. Can I go back to the third slide, Sam? Thank you. So I just wanted to come on to the next finding, which is arguably the most sort of politically significant shift. And I think this is about how we're seeing protest increasingly framed as a security issue, and the sort of pervasiveness of national security and counterterrorism logics, and how they've become embedded in protest policing. And this is about the sort of recharacterization of protest as threat, whether that is to public order or to national security, or to sort of vaguely defined ideas of British values or the so-called pillars of democracy. Protest is painted as a threat to all of these quite empty notions, which I think are increasingly invoked by government relying on nationalism for its legitimacy. And these so-called cultural values and terms, such as loyalty and foreign influence, which often pop up within this kind of language, are often racially coded. And so you have protest movements in which non-white people appear visibly much more at risk of this characterization, and the sort of political expression of Muslim and racialized groups conflated with this idea of state threats. This idea that it's un-British to oppose the interests of weapons manufacturers, or undemocratic to undertake direct action against structures that you view as unjust. This very much speaks to the conflation of corporate interests with democratic interests, but it's also about the how the interpretation of protest as inherently violent justifies more and more intrusive and punitive measures against activists. And I think, interestingly, this sort of like construction of certain forms of protest as illegitimate draws these really clear boundaries where it's quite stark in reflecting whose interests are being protected and whose are being challenged. For example, if you look at how counterterrorism or national security legislation is almost used as this buffer between weapons manufacturers on the one hand and those wishing to challenge the military industrial complex on the other hand, to the point where they've assigned this sort of exceptional status of being key infrastructure or democratic interests in themselves. Can I go to point 5, please? Thank you. So at the same time that all of this is happening, we're also seeing this widening accountability gap. And I've spoken about the proliferation of police powers, the sort of discretion of police powers. And I think alongside this, we're also seeing the erosion of accountability mechanisms. That's formal mechanisms like tribunals and misconduct hearings, but also the informal or sort of movement-led mechanisms that we've introduced in attempts to keep ourselves safe. So legal observers and protest journalists and others who attempt to document and to scrutinise and to keep watch on police behaviour and state repression. And amid these two sort of parallel trends, there's this growing gap within which police are increasingly able to use violence and punishment without repercussion. There are loads of other things I could have mentioned, but I won't go into detail on. I would really encourage everyone to read the report if you're able to. I just wanted to include a few reflections just really quickly before I wrap up. And one is just how hard it was to keep this report contained. Things just kept happening. It felt like every week or every couple of days there was a new development, another restriction announced, a twist in a legal case, another awful statement by a government minister, and that went right up to the sort of very, very final line of being able to edit the report only a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, there's lots in store for the next report already. But the other thing is just the sort of longer history, and the fact that the reports are annual, and it's not really in scope to sort of contextualize it down much wider and longer lasting trends of repression. But none of this started in 2025. And there's obviously a much longer trajectory there. Kevin's report speaks to that. But yeah, I think 2025 feels like a point where lots of the trajectories really started to like join together, and lots of things stopped feeling exceptional and they started feeling very standard. And I think that's really the core finding of the report is that these trends have now been embedded into the very normal, very everyday functioning of protest policing. And yeah, with that escalation in mind, I just wanted to finish by saying that if we care about this space, and I'm assuming we are all here because we do, we just need to do everything that we can to actively defend it. Protest isn't illegal yet, and I don't want to play into the chilling effect by dissuading people from taking action, but we should act while we still can. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Bayer. That was fantastic. And it just makes me think in part about the protest that we did outside the London Assembly yesterday, which will obviously go into the 2026 report, and the frustration that we had that there are many politicians who will gladly ban everybody who disagree with them if they're given the chance. And that situation has developed because of the way that repression has become routine over the last 12 months. Obviously, there is a lot more, as Maya said, and you do need to really dive into the report, which, if you haven't seen it already, is available on our website at netpol.org/SOP25, but not now, because now we're going to hear another one of our speakers. So, can I hand over next to Ayo Khalil?
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Mayor. I think honestly, just listening to that, I think it's so important what you've all done and the report you've put together. And I think reading it really, I think, has put into words the difficult experiences of people I know, who have been arrested, who have had their protests repressed, and also myself as well. Actually, I was arrested in December. I'll go on to speak on that in a little bit. Just to sort of introduce myself a bit further. So I'm a psychiatrist by background. A doctor, medical doctor, is my original qualification. I've worked in a high secure unit in the UK. I've worked in crisis teams, and I've worked in community mental health team, and I'm currently working in a general adult acute inpatient unit. So often have been very sort of exposed to vulnerable people. Within these services, there is a lot of interface with police services, and interaction with them and social issues. And I've had a lot of experience dealing with political prisoners as well. Political prisoners based in the UK in terms of been victimized by the British state, but also by foreign governments such as Egypt, Somalia, etc. I just want to say, I think the first thing I'll start off with is just that I think in psychiatry, the diagnoses that we look at, depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth, often put the pathology on the individual. As if it's a sort of intrinsic issue within the individual that they are depressed or they're anxious, that the sickness is within them. And I think particularly when we read, if you have a read through the report and if you look at the state of our country, I would actually say the sickness is within our institutions. It's in our seats of power. It's within the MPs that govern us and supposedly represent us. And that is where the real sickness is. And we are all suffering from that, especially the people who are taking action to stop genocide, to stop evil, to stop injustice. And really, the state has tried to pathologize. And, I see all of these restrictions on protesting as the state's efforts to try and pathologize those who care, those who think injustice is wrong, those who think genocide is wrong. And we are deemed to be the problem. And the so-called treatment is to implement increased police measures, higher number of arrests as we've seen, and abuse of laws and powers. And I think particularly one of the stats that really stuck with me in the report was a 230% increase on the use of certain powers and gathering, which I just thought was absolutely crazy to see that kind of increase. I want to go through a few examples that have really stuck with me as I've been engaging in supporting um, individuals who have been repressed, whether they're healthcare workers. And when we talk about when repression comes routine, it's really in all parts of our society. So higher education, healthcare. West Streeting today just announced that there would be, you know, harder and more restrictive and repressive measures for so-called anti-Semitic doctors, essentially doctors who are anti-genocide, um, who are anti injustice. Um, so I was just talking about I'll just actually I'll go through some examples just in terms of experiences that have really stuck with me, and I think have really exemplified just the current state of our country at the moment when it comes to protesting. So I was actually with Haya Adam, for example, today, and her mum Azza, who outside Southwark Crown Court. And I know in the report it speaks about how certain words are being criminalized, and they were arrested because they said the word intifada, right? So we are seeing how words now are being criminalized, certain chants are being criminalized. And really the chilling effect that we speak about, it actually goes across so many different sectors and parts of our society. So healthcare, I'm not sure if it cut out before, but I've supported a lot of healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, etc., who have faced disciplinary proceedings for wearing the Palestine flag, for wearing watermelon earrings, for even saying that they want to go to a protest on the weekend. Apparently, that is making Jewish colleagues feel unsafe and Jewish patients feel unsafe. And it's this constant sort of framing of anything which is pro-Palestine, anything which is standing against genocide is a safety issue, is an issue of putting another group in jeopardy and making them feel like violence is imminent. And I think looking at how words and expressions of solidarity are being criminalized really just shows you the desperation now that the state and all sort of associated institutions are getting to. And I think one thing I've really seen happening during arrests is violence. May, I know you talked about violence and how that is enacted. I'll give you a few examples. That day we were down in Bronzefield, there was a 70-year-old woman who was flung so hard by police and so violently by police that her jacket ripped, her puffer jacket ripped. I saw her today, I caught up with her today, and she was sort of telling me, you know, just the depth of that ordeal. Another doctor that was there at Bronzefield that day when we were advocating for one of the hunger strikers, Kessa Zuhra, was choked by a police officer to the point where she became unconscious, and she had to go to A&E that evening in order to get a scan of her neck because her neck had been squeezed so tightly. These individuals, these police officers that do this, they often go unnamed. There's no accountability. They continue to work in their jobs, whereas the people that they have inflicted violence on wear these traumas and then these scars mentally, physically on themselves so viscerally, and there is no accountability. I myself, even, you know, my case is ongoing, so I think there's probably limited things as I can say. But my arrest was very violent. As if you've seen videos of it, you'll see. And, you know, there are aspects of that violence that cameras do not always catch. I've been speaking to some individuals who have been arrested at protests recently, and they've been telling me that particularly the back is being targeted as an area of inflicting pain and violence, especially when people are sort of in police vans. If they're thrown in police vans, for example, or carried off in that way, the way they're dumped and the way they're put in these vans, particularly that there's pressure on the back. The back is a very sensitive area. There isn't much musculature. The bones in certain areas can be quite thin, and the structures are quite exposed. And this is really this is a targeted and this is a blazing, malicious and intentional act of violence that we're seeing police implementing. Um, and I think when we look at the measures of accountability, that there aren't really any when it comes to recourse for these individuals. And the chilling effect that we sort of see is that people are scared to go to protests. The families of people who have been arrested, or the families of people who have experienced violence, that they do not want their loved ones to go out to these protests again. They don't want them to take such risks again. And then it becomes a thing of, don't go here, you're going to get arrested. Don't do this, you're going to get arrested. And I think people are scared, but at the same time, I think people are really escalating and taking risk. Particularly when I think about the hunger strikers, the Filton 24 and the Brize Norton 5, who I think are just some of the most amazing and brave people that I could ever come to know. One thing I think I realized when we were down at Bronzefield is that, especially in prisons, the repression and the systems of violence in there are some of the most unchecked systems in this country. Often the violence is something that can't be seen. Obviously, you can't take phones into secure environments. You can't see what is happening in there. It can't be witnessed. If prisoners or the hunger strikers in question, if they were to raise issues of what was happening to them, their legal support and their communication with lawyers would be reduced. They'd be put in solitary confinement. They would face violence. I watched Kessa's press conference today, and I was honestly just so heartbroken as she explained the levels of violence that she experienced whilst in prison that again went unchecked. Faceless, nameless people who continue to enact this violence. And these prisons are run by private companies. When we were down at Bronzefield that day, it was very, very clear that the police could not do much at all. The fact somebody was dying in the prison and was in such a dire state, the police could not do anything. The prison, which was run by a private company, which was run by a corporation, was able to have jurisdiction over a life, whether she could or could not have emergency medical experience, despite nobody being medically trained overlooking that process. And it just goes to show the levels of lack of accountability, really. And I think, as we saw more protests, especially, I think the protests we were seeing outside the prisons was really something I don't think we've really seen so much of that in this country. Anybody feel free to correct me. At least in my lifetime, I've never really seen such mass protests happening outside of prisons, holding the seats of power, the seats of oppression, the seats of violence. And prisons really do represent that. How many prisoners are held on remand, right? They're held in prison. They're not convicted of anything. And they're held there for indefinite periods of time, which is actually a mode of punishment. When they've not been convicted of anything, they've not been sentenced, and they're held there. This is a mode of punishment to break their spirits. And I think when we speak about the repression that is going on, the new bills and the new laws and policing that is going on, I think originally I believe that, this is because obviously they don't want us to protest. They want to restrict our rights to protest. But I think it goes down to an even deeper level of they are trying to break our spirit with these continued releases of legislation, with these honestly brutal forms of violence, often done where cameras cannot see them. In police stations as well, there's violence going on in the police station that, again, nobody has access to it, nobody can see it, but it is happening. And even in these prisons as well, like I spoke about, there are prisoners who are dying, particularly with Bronzefield. A woman gave birth on the cold hard floor in Bronzefield, and they did not bring any medical attention. This was a few years ago, and the baby died. And this is the kind of system that we're really looking at, that does not value human life, that feels that it can take and it can take human life as it wishes, and they're not used to accountability. Several of the prisons that are housing the Filton 24 and the Brize Norton 5, they were panicked. They'd never seen this kind of opposition to their oppression. They'd never seen this kind of opposition to the evil and the injustice that they'd been doing, and they were panicked. We could see that there, and I think it's really important as we face these continued restrictions on our modes of protest, in that we don't waver. For those of you who haven't read the autobiography of Malcolm X, I'd really encourage you to read it. He talks about a protest which was organized originally by some young Black men in America who were trying to march on Washington, D.C. to the White House to make their frustrations known around racism and the Jim Crow system that was present at the time. And he gives a very detailed analysis of how it started off as something which really held power, which really was going to be direct, which was really going to be disruptive. And once the state caught wind of this, it started to implement measures and got the media involved, to the point where it started off as something which was going to be authentic, original, direct, and really disruptive, which protests should be. Really, the government has really tried to box us in, literally. You can't walk over there. You can't do this. You can't do that. What is protest if you can't disrupt? It is supposed to shake the seats of power. It is supposed to shake people in power. It's supposed to send a message. If we allow our protests to be so boxed away to the point where, it's just, it's not even a minor inconvenience anymore. It's just we're part of the scenery at this point. We're shouting and making a bit of noise in the corner. What is that going to do? We really have to fight for our ability to be able to disrupt, to engage in civil disobedience. And Malcolm X talks about this, how it started off as something authentic, direct, and was going to disrupt, and ended up becoming, this kind of kumbaya sort of march where loads of people kind of got involved, and the very same people, white people at the time, who were complicit and also enforcing these Jim Crow laws and that society and the racism of that time, they joined in the march, and it became a thing where the message was even lost. They didn't even know why they were marching. It became just a generalized march. And I think we are really at risk of doing that. And I think the most potent, and I've told anyone anywhere that I can tell, the most potent and powerful form of protest that we've seen has been direct action. It has been direct action. And I've been on panels where they've asked me, what does health justice mean? And I say, I think the Filton 24 and the Brize Norton 5 have practiced the highest forms of health justice, anything more than I've ever done. Why? Because in the actions they aim to take, they aim to disrupt the imperial machine, the conveyor belt of violence and genocide. When you really think about, the quadcopters that are built in some of these factories, they mimic the cries of women and children to draw Palestinians out of their hiding places, to draw them out, and so they can be killed. This is just an unthinkable and unimaginable form of human cruelty. I would say you're morally bankrupt if you're not doing all you can in today's society to try and stop that. And we see, the Filton 24, the Brize Norton 5, and many other political prisoners and activists who have put their bodies on the line, and that is really the highest form of protest. I wish, I could do what they're doing. We all have our place. I think that's really important as well. Doctors, lawyers, campaigners, activists, all of us have our place in this fight. And I'm really proud of them and their efforts to stop the Imperial War Machine, and free Sam. He deserves bail, and free the Bryce Norton Five. And please, keep in your thoughts and prayers and in your actions and in your support. I'm sure Huda's going to speak a bit more about things. Please continue to think of our political prisoners. There's also, I think there's been some fundraising going on as well for them. They really deserve our financial support as well for the risks they've taken, their careers, their futures, their bodies. Some of them did a hunger strike for up to 73 days. I've been in contact with some of them. There's going to be lasting consequences. When you start passing 40 days without eating, the body starts to borrow fat from the brain. That has long-term damage. The body starts to borrow fat from the heart. That causes long-term damage. This is the sacrifice that these individuals have taken. We can't put that into words. And I think, look, I'm in a position, where the risks I've taken, it can impact your job, it can impact your livelihood. And I always just think about in perspective, at the end of the day, I'll always have somewhere to live. I'll always have some money to draw upon. I'll always have some support system. I'll always have food and water, being where I am. But Palestinians, people living in poverty, the people oppressed around the world, right? And this is the thing: the British state is complicit in so many systems of violence all around the world. We look at African countries, Congo, Sudan. We look at Iran, we look at Lebanon. Britain and the British Empire is not just complicit, directly responsible for so many of these tragedies going on around the world. It's our responsibility to use our privileges and our luxuries to work for oppressed people. So yeah, thank you again for Netpol for holding this event. It's really important. Thank you all for listening, and free our political prisoners, and free oppressed people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayo. That was amazing, and it's really important for us that we included the experience of those people who've ended up in prison, because it is the extreme edge of repression, if you like. I mean, the son of one of my friends was facing 18 months in prison on remand. Was fortunately released very recently, but it was only 20 years old. And one of the things that struck me when you were speaking was just this issue around the broader trauma that we as people, as collectively as people, have experienced. And I was reminded of something I read today from an old friend of mine who said, I've just looked it up actually, this is the world of 2026. We have all lived through a genocide. The best of us gave money to the starving, encouraged their friends to participate in that collective endeavor. The worst tried to close down all the discussion of those killings. And that's all true, but in some ways there's the best, and then there's the very bravest. And I think you've done a really great job of talking about who some of those people are. And to move on, I think one of the real defining things about last year was not only the ban that the government introduced on Palestine Action, which was really significant for us. I mean, everybody was desperately trying to find out how to respond to that. There was just, there was no precedent for this. But also the reasons why the government decided to do that ban, because Elbit was under real strain from the direct action that you've talked about. So I'm going to hand over to Huda, and who can give us as much detail as she's able to within any potential restrictions that she may have from having an ongoing legal case. But let me hand over to you, Huda, and let's hear what you've got to say.
First of all, just thank you so much. It's been really powerful to hear from all of you, and to have this report. It's not my first time I've spoken at a Netpol report, and unfortunately I think it just seems to be getting worse in some ways, but the resistance has definitely been growing at the same time. So as you all probably know, Palestine Action was engaged in direct action, which meant going straight to the source of the Israeli weapons industry and shutting down their factories repeatedly. This involved sustained disruption, whether it was blockades, occupations, going inside and breaking the weapons and destroying the weapons inside of these factories. It was about repeatedly disrupting the operations of Elbit Systems, Israel's biggest weapons manufacturer, until they weren't able to operate any longer. And we would say that just one day of a factory being closed was a victory in and of itself. That's one day or 1 hour meant less weapons being transported to the Zionist regime to massacre Palestinians, and meant more disruption to Elbit Systems. But we were effective in not only temporarily closing down Elbit factories, but in permanently shutting down 3 Israeli weapon sites in Britain. On top of that, we managed to force over a dozen companies to cut ties with Elbit Systems, and Elbit lost out on contracts worth billions of pounds. And that was due to hundreds of people. What started off with a few people became hundreds of people, which made a sustained direct action campaign. It was effective. I think the proof is there. The proof is in the pudding. And in the process of Palestine Action, we managed to annoy a lot of powerful people, and that's a good thing. Don't get me wrong, but with that comes repression. And we saw right from the get-go intervention by the Israeli embassy, meeting with government ministers to crack down on Palestine Action, meetings with Elbit Systems and other private weapons manufacturers, politicians who were sponsored and paid for by the pro-Israel lobby and weapons companies, as well as pro-Israel lobby groups, and even Donald Trump after Palestine Action trashed his golf course in Turnberry. The list is quite extensive. And obviously it got to a point where all of that lobbying pressure built up, and the government decided to prescribe Palestine Action, making it a completely unprecedented move to ban a domestic direct action group. And in that decision, it was very clear that the government chose to, has done so for a very long time, to prioritize the interest of a foreign genocidal weapons manufacturer over the freedoms and rights of their own citizens. So I just want to go into what they're actually claiming is the basis of this ban. So when it came through, when we first heard about the prescription, we were told it was based on 3 different incidents. One was an action that happened 3 years ago in Scotland, when 5 people occupied the roof of Thales, which is a French weapons manufacturer which works directly with Elbit Systems. And whilst they were on the roof, they caused some damage to the factory, and they were all convicted of a breach of the peace, what you would kind of possibly expect in that kind of scenario. And we were then told 3 years after that action was actually an act of terrorism. Now, you would think that we would know at the time if an act of terrorism had taken place, but they had decided to retrospectively look back and say, actually, we didn't mention terrorism at the time. That is now going to be considered terrorism and was part of the legal basis for banning Palestine Action. The other was an action at Instro Precision, where during June 2024, during the peak of the genocide, when actionists had managed to break into Elbit's Instro weapons factory and allegedly cause over £1 million worth of damage. And at the time, again, they were not arrested by counter-terrorism police. It was only closer to the prescription date that they decided to include that and say that was also supposedly a terrorist incident. That is yet to go to trial. And then the third is the Filton action. And what is clear about all of this, and the Filton action, which happened in August 2024, was the first time that actionists had actually been arrested by counter-terrorism police for direct action. And they've been held for up to a week without charge, interrogated day and night, which made it completely unprecedented. And then they rounded up 16 more people to make them the Filton 24 over the course of the next few months after that action. What is becoming more and more apparent is the reason they arrested those people, the reason they kept them on remand, was to justify the unlawful ban on Palestine Action. They needed to say that there are offences under terrorism in order to later be able to justify the ban on Palestine Action. And we know now that they were discussing potentially banning Palestine Action before the Filton Action had taken place. They needed to make the case fit, and that is what they did. They essentially used the Filton 24 as political pawns to justify the ban on Palestine Action. And with that came people being spending up to 18 months on remand without a single conviction. And when the first lot of them went to trial, not only were they all acquitted of the most serious charge against them, which carried a maximum of life in prison of aggravated burglary, 3 of them were also acquitted of violent disorder, and not a single one of them was convicted of a single offence. And if we really resonate with that, what that means is that those people were held in prison, and Sam Corner, who's not convicted of anything, continues to be held without being convicted of a single offence. And I think it's clear, I think it's obvious that you can, guess that the jury could see through what was happening. They could see the overreach by the state, and they were not willing to be a part of that. And actually, it's quite extraordinary because, every challenge they faced was severe repression by the state. But as soon as they were in front of ordinary people, they managed to secure their freedom, and the freedom of 23 out of the Filton 24. But I think what that case shows and that result shows is actually it shows what's happening throughout all of this repression is the state overreach has been massively backfiring. They tried with the Filton 24 to put these ridiculous charges on them, and they couldn't land a single conviction. They tried with Palestine Action to banners, to prescribers, to call us terrorists. And what happened? 3,000 people have been arrested as a result, and in resistance to the ban by holding up placards and opposing the ban. And they made Palestine Action and the idea of Palestine Action a household name, and showed people across the country that that direct action is possible. It normalized the idea of direct action. And now we've seen that all of that attempts to stop us not only backfired in terms of throughout the public sphere, but also it was proven to be unlawful since its very inception. And as you all know, the ban was ruled unlawful, and this was in front of 3 very pro-government judges. And it was quite an extraordinary result that they ruled that it was disproportionate to freedom of speech and to the right to protest, and that the Home Secretary didn't follow her own policy when deciding to prescribe Palestine Action. And a lot of the cases where people were arrested for holding up a private eye joke, for just having a play on words on a placard, or someone was even stopped for waving a Palestine flag. And these incidents actually continue to happen. Just made it impossible for them to legitimize and to maintain this ban. Of course, they are trying to appeal the ban, and that will be going to appeal the ruling of the High Court. That will be going to the Court of Appeal not so long, at the end of April, and we hope to have a result very soon for the ban to be lifted and for Palestine Action to come back. And when Palestine Action comes back, it will be stronger than ever before because of how the state has popularized it and how many people have sacrificed to disrupt the Israeli weapons industry, and how their sacrifice has reached hundreds hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people in Britain and across the world. And I just want to quickly mention, Ayo, you went into great depth about the hunger strike, and I really appreciate that. But I think we can look back now, and realize that the government, Parliament laughed when they discussed, MPs laughed when they discussed the hunger strike, when these people were about to die. The government refused to meet with them for what? To justify an unlawful ban. The effects, the lengths they've gone to in order to implement this ban has included remanding people without convictions for a year and a half, repressing them in such severe ways, abusing them, committing violence against them in the prisons, to the point where people are going on hunger strike for 73 days to resist against that, arresting thousands of their own citizens for what? To protect the Israeli weapons industry. That is what they have done. That's what they continue to do. And in the process of doing that, they are only exposing themselves. And I truly believe it's just a matter of time before we win and the ban is lifted.
Thank you, Huda. That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. One of the consequences of the success of the judicial review, of course, was that the Metropolitan Police, at least, have said that they are not going to be arresting people for holding up a sign anymore. They're only going to be, they say, gathering intelligence for the future. Hopefully, the future is not terribly rosy for them. I do know that there is a mass action where people will be holding up signs again. I believe it's the 11th of April. But you can certainly find out more information about that on the from Defend Our Juries, who are organising that particular protest. I want to ask a quick question. Starting off initially with Mayo, because I think it's relevant in terms of the report, because it talks about the report discusses the chilling effects, but also acknowledges that people are continuing to mobilize, but that's not true necessarily for everybody. So the question for the panelists that I'd like you to consider is, and Maya, if you want to go first, who is being pushed out or criminalized, and what does that mean for our movements?
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, this was something that really sat across the report. And I think the first thing to say is that, unsurprisingly, the impacts of repression follow sort of typical lines of marginalisation and minoritisation. And the report is really clear that the effects aren't evenly distributed, so they're falling most heavily on those who are already exposed to harm. Racialized protesters, migrants, disabled people, trans activists, working class activists, people with less secure legal status, gendered activists, etc. And the way that this plays out is that arrest then isn't just a legal risk for some, but actually a sort of physical and personal and very violent risk, as Ayo so eloquently spoke about. One trans activist that I spoke to, for example, described deliberately avoiding protest where arrest was likely because being held in detention meant potentially being denied medication, and misgendering and attacks on basic dignity. And actually, this one person spoke about how the risk factor applied to being trans had actually become an excuse for over policing, particularly in the context of custody. And yeah, similarly, speaking to other people about their sort of degrading experiences at the hands of police on the streets, as well as in custody and within courts, disabled people being denied very basic accessibility, black and brown protesters facing much higher levels of violence and suspicion. And yeah, it won't be a surprise to anyone who's noticed the sort of sweeping criminalisation of particular protest movements, as I mentioned. But yeah, this idea of like that the expansion of police powers doesn't really it means sort of intensifying those existing structures of inequality. And I think what that does is like sort of narrow who's safely able to participate. Doesn't necessarily push people out of movements because I think people are still very much showing up, but it means some people are having to navigate much higher levels of risk and they're much more exposed to levels of violence and criminalization when they do participate. And I think, yeah, that has real implications for how movements operate, who can be present, and who's also able to participate and is sort of targeted and criminalized over time.
Um, Ayo, could I put that question to you? Is there anything more you want to add on that? On that?
Yeah. Again, thank you, Maya and Huda, like just for your amazing contributions. I think in terms of the chilling effect, I wanted to speak about something in the report about arrest, about prosecution. I think I spoke earlier about remand, but I think there's also what I'm seeing quite commonly is arrests. Sometimes people are charged or not charged, and there is this kind of bail period, which is kind of a limbo, a gray area. You don't really know where you are legally. You don't know what to expect. This can then be extended and extended. Conditions can sometimes be quite restrictive, stopping you from moving in certain areas, keeping you sort of looking over your shoulder. And I think that gray area and that limbo for some people can be particularly unbearable. Um, Work sort of hangs in the balance. If you are charged or convicted, that can have implications on your work, your livelihood, your family, and you're just not really sure, right? It's that constant feeling of not being sure. I know this is not necessarily so much to do with chilling effect, but I think for example, I think one of the worst forms of arrest is, which I think I'd speak about, is dawn raids. And what these powers are really used to do is to really disrupt and yeah, just affect the bubble of safety that people have, right? Coming to them at the times when they're sleeping or when they are most vulnerable and they're supposed to feel most safe, which is in their houses, and breaking in, kidnapping them, enacting violence on them and their families as well, when they're there. Um, people are seeing this, right? And this is even now we're seeing, there's a doctor, Dr. Rahma, who's been arrested for social media posts, for example. All of this impacts, it makes you think twice about, should I retweet that? Should I post that? Should I say that? Right? Because you're seeing what's happening to other people. And I think for me, this is why I think it's particularly important that people do more at these times, even if there are repercussions. I think it's important that we don't let that chilling effect, become something that becomes so widespread that nobody, wants to do anything. I think it's really important to do that because the more people are scared to speak up, the more pressure is placed on less people, right? The less people are left to take risk. What we've been seeing with direct action is more and more people actually willing to take part in it. That's what we need. And even if you're not able to directly take part in it, at least support people who are financially, with your skills, with your resources, right? I think before this genocide, especially, direct action was a bit of a dirty word. It's a bit of thing people didn't want to get involved with, like, oh, that, we're too respectable for that. Whereas now things have really shifted, and I think people are understanding that's the best way to do things. I think there's a responsibility on all of us to make sure that it stays like that and we don't let the dial go back. Even though there have been a lot of things have gotten worse with legislation and with certain powers, we have also had wins, and we've also need to realize that things which were seen as politically and in the organizing sense not being acceptable, being taking things too far, that's no, direct action is no longer a thing that it's no longer seen as taking things too far. It's seen as actually disproportionate to what we're facing today. So yeah, I'll just say that.
Thanks. So, Huda, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think they covers quite a lot of ground there. But one of the things with the ban is that if you ban Palestine Action, that didn't necessarily just mean you're banning the people taking direct action, right? Which it did mean for them. If you're taking direct action to Palestine Action, you would face being a member of a terrorist organization and face up to around 10 years in prison, even if you just did a lock-on in front of a factory. But also it was the support team, it was the media team, all of those people who are not taking direct action constantly, but are part of an ecosystem that makes a movement work, would overnight have been members of a terrorist organization. And then on top of that, you have all of the people in the communities, the people who come out to support the actions, that come out to the court cases, that come out to the trials. And when it hit midnight, people didn't know on July the 5th when the prescription came into force. People didn't know what was going to happen the next week, if everyone was going to get rounded up, if people could protest against the helping systems, and how this would react. So they actually criminalized so many people, and the phrase "we all Palestine Action" became popularized for a reason. It wasn't just the people taking direct action; it was the whole ecosystem of people around them that made the direct action possible, that made the action sustainable. But then you have, of course, just the wider community, Arab communities as well, the Palestine community, where they're not sure if they can even express support of direct action. What does that mean? And that's, a huge part of what was in the prescription cases. It's not even just the thousands of people who've been arrested as a result of the prescription. It's the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people whose speech is chilled as a result of the ban, who may not anymore say what they want to say because they don't know if they're going to get arrested or rounded up. And I think tying that in with how surveilled people are on social media and how the wrong retweet or the wrong post, people will collate everything you say, send it off to the counterterrorism police, and the counterterrorism police will be around yours in a week. That's how it works now. If you're of a certain political, if you're anti-genocide, of course, that's how it works for people in our movement.
Thanks, Huda. I want to just very quickly abuse my position as chair by also just chipping in an answer on this, because I think there's an element of the last part of that question, which is what does it mean for us as movements? And I think so much and so eloquently has been said tonight about the importance of centering the care of others in order to make sure that people are not excluded, that they're not felt that they can't participate, and that shouldn't fall on the responsibility of individuals. That's something that movements need to think about themselves. We need to be thinking about how we look after each other better. And actually, on that, Mayor, I want to come back to you just very quickly because I know you talked in the report a lot about some of the legal support networks, and I wonder whether you want to just add anything on that at all.
Thank you, Kevin. I think the sort of role that legal support networks play in ensuring that the state is held to account. I would never want to sort of undermine the importance of that. I think, like I've mentioned, it's unavoidable that some of the more formal accountability mechanisms are weakening. We're seeing legislation being ushered through that includes anonymity for firearms officers, moves to make it harder for the police to be found guilty of misconduct. But I would be very skeptical of how well these structures worked in the first place. And I think accountability's always come from us, really. I just think a huge part of this resistance is those who build and maintain and resource the structures that hold police accountable for their abuses and for repression. I'd go to legal observers and to legal and defendant and arrestee support groups and all of those people who are ensuring that people know their rights and that they're moving through incredibly opaque and sort of intentionally confusing and like life destroying at times legal procedures, and that they're also doing it with the solidarity of others with sort of similar experiences. But also the role that those groups play in recording and documenting police practices. I think Netpol, we try and play a bit of a sort of convening role between these groups across the country in an attempt to be able to build a picture. Just huge respect to everyone that's on the ground, like collecting and reporting on this stuff. And just tiny thing to add on to that, I think there are roles that anyone can play within this infrastructure. And I would really encourage that as a very sort of like accessible form of resistance, regardless of your capacity or your ability to absorb risk.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. I mean, that's absolutely the case that we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do if it wasn't for the frontline support of volunteers who go out and monitor what the police are doing. And it is a really important part of effective resistance to the repression that we're facing. Just before we finish up, can I just go back to our guests and just ask them one final question, which is, you have obviously talked a lot about this already, but what else, apart from what May's talked about, does effective resistance look like? Let me go to Ayo first.
I think this is a really good question, and I've been sort of thinking over it. I think for us to resist effectively, I think it takes courage. Um, there are several sectors in society where people are resisting. So I spoke about higher education before. Haya Adam from SOAS, she was expelled from SOAS, and the encampment there is still going on. We saw the student encampments going on up and down the country around a year ago or so. And that itself was a form of resistance. And, there's been a lot of disruptions of university board meetings where they are, serenading companies like Bay Systems, Barclays, HSBC, who all have investments and stakes in this violent genocide financial ecosystem. In the healthcare setting, um, I think there are more doctors now who are speaking out about what Israel is doing to healthcare workers in Palestine, and also how Zionist interests are becoming embedded in our healthcare systems. We look at Palante, for example, a 330 million pound contract was agreed with the NHS. Palante is a weapons spy tech company that, you know, if you look at their CEO and some of their board members are pure evil, have laughed about, when questioned about genocide. They've brazenly talked about it, something being good. War is good for business. These are the kind of people who are getting involved in our NHS. There are so many levels of resistance, and often it requires courage and consistency. Um, and in schools, for example, teachers are finding, I went to an education conference at the Education Union, with teachers a few months back. In the classrooms now, you know, there are certain things you can't say, certain views you can't express in support of Palestine, in support of being against genocide. Um, there are so many layers of resistance we can engage in. It's in really challenging the structures we have in our society at every shape and form, at every level, stopping the embedding of violence and genocide in all of our structures. And, for example, I know some people who, um, you know, even the Palestine flag at work, right? Being told they can't wear that. And a lot of people have just let that go, but there are other people who have said no, on a level of principle, like, I will not let you erase Palestinian identity. I won't let you erase the fact that genocide is happening. So I think those are all levels we can do. But I think, again, I come back to direct action, in that at the end of the day, we need to, all of our efforts, in some way, shape, or form, cumulatively need to be directed at how can we actually stop these weapons being made? How can we stop these companies functioning? How can we stop them profiting from our society? For me, that is always going to be the ultimate focus. And I think Palestine Action and the actionists involved, the activists that have been involved over the years, they have spearheaded that. And there are other organizations that sort of come to mind. Sort of Cage International has been really great in supporting political prisoners, and dealing with casework of people who have been arrested or have faced repression in their day-to-day lives. I speak to sometimes people in tech and finance. They're in a completely different world. Very wealthy. I'll probably say sometimes quite, often quite up themselves. Think they're creme de la creme, and they feel like, the real way to make a difference is having a seat at the table, right? And I challenge them: what is the point of having our degrees? What is the point of having our wealth and our resources if we're not pouring it into stopping oppression, into stopping genocide? So I think there's really a revolution that needs to take place in all parts of our world, we're not focused on capitalism. We're not focused on putting, profits over people. violence over humanity. At the end of the day, that is really what I feel like we need to put all our efforts into. And it's going to take time, but I think it's something, it's a change that we need to force and we need to push. And I do believe we will win, and I do believe we'll get there. So I hope that's summarized the answer to your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Sayed. That was great. Can I give the final word on what does effective resistance look like to Huda?
Yeah, well, my first thought when you say that is effective resistance now looks like terrorism, unfortunately. But on a more serious note, um, I think it's about being on both the offensive and the defensive. And I think the last year has really encompassed that. If I take it from a more of a Palestine Action perspective, when Palestine Action was prescribed, it was important that people knew that the actual tactic of direct action wasn't being prescribed in and of itself. And direct action has continued against Elbit Systems, it has continued against other associated firms, and that has been ongoing. And at the same time, there have been thousands of people resisting the ban by pulling themselves out there, by holding up placards, and defending our movement against this attack on all of us, but most importantly on the Palestinian people. So I think we have to continue with direct action. The key thing is it's about disrupting, it's about disruption. Like we said before, if you have a protest and it's not causing any disruption and it's not going to cause the effect that we need, that is necessary when people in Gaza are still going through genocide, and people in Lebanon, a seventh of Lebanon is completely displaced because of the Israeli military right now, and people are being bombed in Iran as we speak. So the urgency of taking action hasn't gone away, but we have to both support the direct action and take it ourselves, and also defend our movement, whether that's on the streets or in the courtroom.
Thanks, Huda. That's great. I'm conscious that we're running a little bit out of time. There's a couple of things I need to do before we leave. Actually, the first of those is I noticed in the participant list that Pepper from GBC is in the meeting. I'd just like to thank Pepper for proofreading our report and apologise for our many spelling mistakes. One of the things about both last year's and this year's state of protest reports is they don't have recommendations, and that's deliberate. Recommendations are going to come from the movements that we support and we work with, but we need to have a discussion. We need to have a proper discussion about how we resist the growing repression, how we make sure that what is looking increasingly like it's routine is challenged, that we push back. We're following this up with a series of in-person events to talk about the report. On the 15th of April, that will be at Community Base in Brighton. On the 16th of April, there's a joint meeting with War on Want at Proposition Studios in Bethnal Green in London. And in late April, early May, we haven't quite finalised the date because we're just checking out a venue. There will be an event in Manchester. So if you're interested in being part of those discussions, make sure you're on our mailing list, and make sure you stay in contact, and we'll try and promote those as widely as we can. I also want to thank, in terms of being able to make this possible, I want to give a thank to the Article 11 Trust, whose name you would have seen on the front of the report and on some of the publicity. They have been responsible for not only for making sure that we have got the funding to be able to do this, but also done some loads and loads of work funding some amazing frontline groups to get legal support over the last couple of years. And I think we really want to acknowledge that as well. If you haven't seen the report yet, or you haven't got it yet, make sure you go to our website and download it. And as I said, if you want to be part of this debate, please join our mailing list, and we'll find every way we possibly can to be able to continue this discussion. So thanks everyone for coming. It's just a little bit under 8:25. That's all for this evening, and I look forward to seeing you again at another Netpol meeting very soon.